I'm Sam Brobbeck, Assistant Editor at Pensions Insight, and I'm here with Mark Pemberthy, Executive Director at JLT Employee Benefits. Good morning, Mark.
Morning, Sam.
How are companies coping with the busiest period for auto-enrolment so far?
Yeah, so far so good. All of the providers and the major consultancies have worked hard on their 2014 propositions to make sure that they can deal with the scale that we're likely to see in this year. I think the next 6 months is absolutely vital. So the big peaks come obviously this summer. The time that we're seeing these smaller organisations give mean that they're just starting to do that work now. So the next few months is absolutely vital in seeing whether that stands up to the test.
And how are the challenges different for small and medium-sized companies compared to the bigger companies that staged before?
They're different in a number of ways. So firstly, they've got much less resource to deal with it internally. So typically for the larger organisations, there'd have been pension managers, there would have been big HR resource and payroll resource available. Whereas for the smaller organisations, it may even be just one person where it's not a full-time role. So internally, they don't have the level of expertise and experience. But they also then don't have the budget to be taking on lots of external input as well. They're also dealing in an environment where they're competing for the time of people who can support them much more than the larger organisations were, and those suppliers just don't have the same flexibility to amend their propositions for the needs of those small companies. So they're having to deal with much more standardised products with less time, less money and with less people.
Are you seeing much evidence for smaller companies leaving auto-enrolment to the last minute?
Yeah, we are seeing quite a bit of evidence of organisations leaving it later than they need to. Throughout auto-enrolment over the last few years, we've seen organisations consistently underestimate how much work it is to adopt the new operating requirements that they have. So the early stages were typically giving themselves up to 18 months, and most of those didn't have lots of spare time at the end of that as they got towards the end of that project. Now we're seeing organisations giving themselves much shorter periods of time. So we've just gone through a calendar year. A lot of organisations who are staging this year would have seen auto-enrolment as a 2014 issue. They wouldn't have even started thinking about it in 2013. They come to the start of this year, it's now on their agenda. Some of them will have a matter of 2 or 3 months in which to prepare. And it is possible to go through an auto-enrolment project in 3 months. But if you have to take employees through consultation, if you have to make changes to HR or payroll systems, you may well need much more than that. And many existing pension providers are requesting or demanding at least 3 months before staging to be told how their scheme will be used in order to give that permission. So you can very easily run out of time if you don't give yourself a good 3 to 6 months to prepare.
What sort of stumbling blocks are companies encountering in terms of compliance when they approach auto-enrolment?
So at the heart of compliance is the assessment process, and that's really critical to get right. So the abilities that the existing payroll provider has in providing some solutions around that is really critical. Understanding what they can do and what the cost and timescales are for them to implement any solutions that they have there. If the payroll provider isn't able to provide an assessment solution, and not all still can, then the company needs to look at how it breaks its pay cycle to do that assessment outside, and that can have some real operational challenges. Outside of that, getting the right pension scheme in place is critical, particularly if they're not engaging with their existing providers early enough. And then finally, getting the right communication to the right people at the right time continues to be a stumbling block for a lot of organisations.
You mentioned before about a capacity crunch. What sort of advisors do you think are going to be particularly stretched?
I think any advisor who is looking at every client as a bespoke situation is going to really struggle as we get into the back end of this year. And so if we look at the way that auto-enrolment has evolved since the outset, back in mid-2012 in the very first organisation stage, over the last 18 months we've really been dealing with very large client-centric projects which are typically well-resourced and given a long period of time. But very quickly, typically literally within a matter of months, the industry's had to then move to having much higher levels of organisations to deal with in a much more standardised way. So dealing with them in a very robust, very process-oriented way is absolutely critical in being able to deal with the tens of thousands of organisations that are staging this summer. And anybody who's still trying to deal with organisations in the way that they might have been engaging them already, I think will really struggle.
Each week seems to bring a new master trust. Do you think there'll be consolidation in the market at some point?
I guess it probably is. I mean, one of the key things for pension schemes is getting the critical mass, getting sufficient members and assets in place so that the scheme can run effectively and provide good value and good outcomes for members. And I think having variety in the pensions market is absolutely essential. You look across UK employers, there's so many different employer objectives, workforce demographics, that having a very homogenous pensions market I don't think is a good thing. So variety is very good, but critical mass is absolutely important for delivering those good outcomes. So if not all of those schemes can reach that critical mass in a timescale which is commercially viable for them, then I think consolidation is inevitable, yes.
What sort of challenges do you think we're going to see in the next year, and do you think opt-out rates will stay as low as they are?
Yes, I think the challenges for the next 12, 18 months or so are run over a couple of different areas. So one is obviously making sure that we can get through the summer. So the first real scale tests of auto-enrolment are yet to come. The next 3 to 6 months really does show whether pension providers and pension support industry and consultancies, etc., can really deal with the kind of scale that we're looking at over the coming months. So at the end of this summer, we'll have a much better idea whether capacity crunch exists or not. I think we then have a decent period of pause. So the end of 2014, early 2015 actually isn't that busy in terms of the number of stages, but then we have another peak at the end of next year. But as we go into 2016 and 2017, then we go from having tens of thousands of organisations staging each month to hundreds of thousands over a period of best part of 2 years. Now that really is the capacity crunch, and so there's no doubt that the current auto-enrolment propositions will have to evolve again in order to deal with that market. So the challenges that we see from a delivery point of view are making sure that we can meet the needs of the organisations that are staging this year, but then go through another reinvention to make sure that those lessons can then be transferred into the latter stages. I think there's then another set of opportunities and challenges for organisations that have already staged. And so a lot of companies that have already staged will invariably have a look at how they've done things and potentially change that. And there could be any number of catalysts for that. So they might be looking at their scheme providers, the way they're operating their DC schemes. That in itself could be a reason to change. We've had a reasonable degree of legislative change and more proposals on the way in terms of excluding certain employee groups. That again is an opportunity to look at the way that auto-enrolment is operating in a workforce. And there may be a business may be changing their HR or payroll systems. So any of these is a reason or an opportunity to look at how auto-enrolment is being operated in that employer and see whether there's any operational effectiveness or operational risks that can be reduced. So there's a good opportunity for organisations over the next 12 to 18 months to do that. And in terms of the opt-out rates, currently we haven't really seen much of a deviation away from that sort of 10% opt-out rate. But I would guess that as we move into the smaller employers, we do expect that to rise. We still see if there's an interesting paper from New Zealand just gone through their 6th anniversary of auto-enrolment, and their opt-out rates in a slightly different environment are consistently running at around 25%. So if it's the behavioural economics and those the inertia points kind of hold true globally, then we would expect to see the opt-out rate start to veer upwards a little bit. But I would hope not, and I certainly see that there's been some really positive outcomes so far from auto-enrolment and expect those to continue.
Thank you very much, Mark.